You are listening to the Freedom Podcast with Van Moody. Our desire is that you begin to live in freedom every day. Freedom in your mind, freedom in your finances, freedom from the external pressures of life. Prepare to be transformed as we seek to be free, mind, body, and soul. Let's get started.
Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us today on the Freedom Podcast. And specifically, we're going to dig into an important topic that we cover every single month, and that is financial freedom. And so I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Pastor George B. Thompson, all the way from Los Angeles. We are super excited to jump into today's topic with you. And if you are new to the Freedom Podcast, let me welcome you for joining us on this podcast. On the Freedom Podcast, we cover a wide variety of topics that's designed to help you live your best life, and particularly a life of freedom, a life of purpose, a life of creativity, and most importantly, the life that God intended for you to live. So we cover a wide variety of topics that pertain to life, purpose, freedom, and happiness. But one of the topics that we address every month is financial freedom, because we understand that finances is one of the topics and often one of the biggest areas where people are in bondage. And sometimes it's described as the biggest hurdle or impediment to people living a life of freedom and ultimately their best life. And so every single month we talk about financial freedom, and there is nobody that I know better to help me co-lead this Financial Freedom Podcast episode than my brother from another mother, Pastor George B. Thompson, all the way from L.A., sunny L.A. Is it sunny now, George? Is it still raining in L.A.?
It is sunny now. People were asking me if God told me to build an ark, and I had to say no, and then the sun came back out. So yes, it is sunny now.
Excellent. Well, George, on today's episode of Financial Freedom, we are going to talk about what do we do now? Because we have seen most recently a rash of issues with banks. Many people have been following the headlines of the SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, and other banks that have failed. We know that we're also living in an inflationary environment. You know, people stay wrapped to what the Federal Reserve is going to do. Will we finally start seeing a drop in interest rates? But we also know that inflation has impacted all of us in a variety of ways. And depending on the margin in your life and how you operate your finances, inflation can hit you hard. And so on today's episode, we are really going to engage in semiotics. And so, George, let me give the biblical background on this, and then I'm excited for us to jump into it. Many people may or may not be aware with 1 Chronicles 12 and 32 that talks about a very unique tribe from the nation of Israel. They were called the tribe of Issachar. And in 1 Chronicles 12 and 32, it says that the men of Issachar understood the signs of the times and knew what Israel might do. Now, what that means is that they were semioticians, and semioticians comes from the word semiotics, and semiotics is the science or the study of signs that comes from the Greek word semia. And what we often don't talk about is the importance of us studying the signs correctly and understanding what we should do in light of those signs. Now, what's interesting is that semiotics has been around us and continues to be around us. As a matter of fact, you can't get a driver's license without passing a semiotics test. Your driver's license test is a test of signs. But this is also extremely biblical, because Jesus insisted that the disciples themselves pass a semiotics test and know how to read the signs of the times, not just the signs of the sky. And you see this in Matthew 16. So I believe that semiotics and understanding what do we do now is extremely important biblically. It's important culturally, but it's also important financially. Now, on a side note, for those that may be interested more on this topic, I'm actually going to be leading a cohort of doctoral students in a doctoral program on semiotics, along with Dr. Leonard Sweet later in the fall. If you're interested in any information around that, go out to my website, vanmoody.org, and you'll find information about it. But the point is, I am actually leading this doctoral studies program with Dr. Leonard Sweet because of how significant semiotics is to our world today. And on today's episode of our Freedom podcast, particularly financial freedom, we're going to get into semiotics because you cannot begin to make good financial decisions without reading the signs of the times to understand what we ought to do now. So, George, let's get into it, brother. When it comes to everything that we've seen in our culture today, banks collapsing, inflation increasing, what does this mean for us, and what are some of the most important next steps that we should be engaging in now to make sure that we don't just survive this time, but that we continue to thrive in the midst of it?
Exactly. And, when you were talking about the signs and doing it, I got so excited because now when we look at what happened, we talk about the tribe of Issachar, but you're also looking at like how we see signs and how we react to them. If you ever flown on an airplane, you don't sit up at the front and actually watch the pilots. But what happens is there's someone actually telling them where to come in and where to come in and where the gate. And that actually has you have a very nice trip. But then we have to do that exact same thing when it comes to our investments, but then also what we have stewardship over. So just really quickly, God gives you stewardship in 4 areas. Can everybody just hold up 4 fingers? I know you may be driving in your car, and maybe, you also may watch it, but hold up 4 fingers. God gives you stewardship in 4 areas. The first is time. There's 86,400 seconds in a day. The second is he gives you a skill. You'll have a spiritual gift. There's nobody like you in the world. As you know, it says in Ephesians 2:10, we're uniquely made. Third, he gives us a temple, a body that we have. And then fourth, what we're going to talk about right now, he gives you treasure. So those are the 4 T's: time, talent, temple, treasure. So in your finance, you have to look at how we're going to manage at 3 things. We've talked a little bit about this before, but in 2022, there are 3 challenges that we just had. And these are the signs, and I'm going to call this the signs of the time. Number 1 was inflation, and I'm going to use hyperinflation. If you remember, Bishop Van, we talked a little bit earlier about how my family went on a trip to Hawaii, and what did I do? I brought all my food with me. Not all of it, but I brought most of it with me. The in-between, remember the glean on it? So I brought the in-between. We had inflation. So that's when you look at the price of gas, but now you see gas go down, but look at the price of diesel fuel. That's what's actually delivered places. In other words, like that's what trucks use to drive things to grocery stores. That's what things happen in that way. Also for restaurants. So number 1, we had inflation. So we have to look at how we're going to deal with this. I'm going to come back to you and we'll talk about that. Then the second is interest rates. But then also I want to go into the third. I'm going to come back to interest rates because that's really what we want to talk about. Is the war in Ukraine. Is if you remember that happened and that started causing inflation, but also it's an area of prayer. And you remember we talked about this. Is this an area of prayer? Because when they become getting invaded, they're leading exporters of olive oil and also grain. So if they can't export, they can't plant anything in the middle of a war and things like that. They can't plant things. They can't harvest things. So that creates inflation. Then when people move to Poland, that creates more inflation even in Poland. If something's $1.27 for bread in Poland, then it's going to go to $2.27. Then they have to get the grain from somewhere else. Then it's $3. You see the price keeps rising, and that has exports.
Hey George, let me ask you a quick question.
Go ahead.
So for our listeners who have maybe heard about inflation but don't fully understand the mathematics around inflation, define that for them. Because you talked about the war in Ukraine and how that was a cause because they're one of the leading exporters of grain. Help our listeners understand kind of the math of inflation. That when certain factors happen, they cause inflation, and then you can pick it up from there.
Gotcha. And then I'm gonna come back to you on that, actually, inflation. So what inflation actually is, let's go over it and defining it is. It means that there's a lot more dollars and there's a less demand. So what happens is that there's a lot of dollars and less demand. So what happens is if there's a very few products, then the price rises in the dollar. So it becomes inflated like a balloon. So then what happens? So like, let me give you some very specific examples. You used to be able to buy groceries and then we used to be able to buy groceries where you could get a whole bag of groceries for $20. Now it's much more. If you look at what it would cost for a family to eat out in dinner, they have a place out here in California. It's called In-N-Out. There's another place called Fat Burger. Me and my family went out to eat at Fat Burger, and there's 5 people. It was fast food. It was about $100. That to me is a lot for fast food. So that is how inflation works, is the price of something is inflated in that area. That a little more color to it. Or you want to use another example?
Well, yeah, and I think it's important. Context. I always talk about context. In fact, I teach communicators that a text without context is a pretext. So we know that a part of what the pandemic did was the pandemic put pressure on a lot of the goods and services that we were getting from other places. And so, for an example, you see inflation with cars. If you ever try to buy a car in this kind of environment, I unfortunately had to do that recently. Well, then the price of cars is higher, right? Mm-hmm. Because the inventory is smaller. So because a lot of cars that come in from overseas were delayed, the components were harder to get, the chips were harder to get because of what was happening in China. It meant then that the production of cars was lower. And so supply and demand. When the production of cars is lower, there are fewer cars for which people can buy, then there's a premium on the cars that are available, which is why a lot of dealers are attaching like a premium above MSRP. That's how inflation works. So when you look at the war in Ukraine and the impact on the goods and services that we were importing from that region, well, those go down, which means then the cost of goods goes up. So that's another example.
Right. And this is good. And then we're going to interest rates in a moment. But the reason why that actually happened also is what you just brought up, Bishop Van, is that it was supply chain issues. When they didn't have chips, you would walk on a car lot and say, like, hey, you say, I want this car with this and that. When they walk on the lot and there's only 3 cars, you say, you know what? I just want to have a car. So I'm just going to take a car. I'm going to take a car that may not be the color I want or something else. But also, they were selling certain cars for $25,000 over what they were worth because people were willing to pay it. And that's how it worked. Also, people were buying. They were buying more than they needed. If you remember, toilet paper and paper towels. We actually did even a class on that. During the pandemic, people were buying a lot more because they thought that there might be running out. So when people find out they can't get something, that also overinflates the prices. So that goes back to us being practical, where we learn how to do things practically, so we don't have to panic or in doing that. And then we also see values in certain things. But that's good. We'll come back to that in that area.
George, in light of now our listeners understanding, okay, this is what inflation is. This is what caused the climate that we're in. I think the next logical question is, what do we do? You've got inflation. You've also got 2 prominent banks, a couple of banks that failed.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing about the SVP is that the Federal Reserve stepped in and nobody lost anything. They made everybody whole. But there are some questions and concerns. In fact, I got a call from a very prominent pastor, pastoring one of the largest churches in the country. And he said, hey, man, what are you doing with the money that sits in the bank for your church? He was like, man, we're trying to pull money out and diversify because we're a little concerned. He said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm not concerned about that. He was like, really? You're not moving money? I said, no, I'm not. No. And I began to explain why. But there may be listeners who are thinking the same thing or have some of the same questions. And so let me toss you a pitch so you can hit a home run, George. What should we be doing now in light of these realities in our culture?
Right. So first of all, everybody and everything, first of all, don't panic because there's something called FDIC insurance. That's a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that actually works. That's a company that insures your deposits. So first of all, it used to have a limit, and it used to be $100,000. But now it's $250,000 per account. So as you got phone calls, you obviously know how many phone calls. I got a lot too. So if you have under $250,000 in a bank, that's what they use. And then also there's one for credit unions, the NCUA, the same thing. And then brokerages use another one. But first, it's $250,000 under FDIC per account. That means, Bishop Moody, if you have an account, and then if you and your wife have another account, then that would be $500,000. So it's per account. Then if you have a business account, that's $250,000 as well. So first of all, that's number one. Then if you also have, I think we should be diversified. First of all, I said that to everybody anyway. So you need to be diversified. If you have one pencil, it can be broken. But if you have 300 pencils, it's very difficult to break all 300. So what happens is you want to be diversified in your portfolios and what you're doing. But if your money is one of the larger banks, that's a little bit different than they were having at actually that bank. And what they were doing. So,
and what's interesting about that, George, is the federal government is so incentivized to make sure that our banking system remains that what we saw with SVP is that the Federal Reserve stepped in and made people whole even when they had bank accounts that were well over the $250,000 limit that you just mentioned. The SVP bank was really the main banking hub for a lot of tech startups, a lot of the Silicon Valley, tech types that came out of Silicon Valley or were functioning there. And so a lot of these corporations had much more than $250,000, but the federal government stepped in and covered everything. And so I think that should also be another layer of encouragement for people. The Federal Reserve wants to make sure that banks work.
Right. I just want to say this about the Federal Reserve also, you guys, and just in doing this is, first of all, the Federal Reserve Bank, there's this gentleman, his name is Jerome Powell. He is the chairman, he is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So I think he's done a very good job in taking us through the pandemic and everything like this. And then why we actually have inflation. One of the reasons also why we have inflation right now is because of all of the funding and all the money that was printed that was during the pandemic. If you remember, everybody, the PPP loans, things like this. So I also would like to give you a little bit of encouragement and tell you there are three things the United States government can do that I think, and I'm sorry to use this type of language. I almost want to use the word gangster, but anyway, there's three things they can do that are just literally incredible. So everybody, you don't have to write these down because I'll just repeat them twice. They're all number ones. Number one thing the U.S. government can do that's like incredible is number one, print money. If you could, right now, you have a printer at your house. Could you imagine going in the back right now and just printing off money and just going out there and buying a car or just buying everything like that? So they can print money. They print it right now as we speak. And then you say how does that get into the economy? They printed trillions of it. That's how that was during the, during COVID. They did that during the pandemic. They did a trillion twice. Okay. And in doing, that's the number one thing they can do. Then the second number one, which is another one, which is number two is that I think is growth. They set interest rates. So they can actually control how much money people have, how much it costs to buy a house, how much, which you're seeing, and we probably will spend a little more time on in our next episode, is how much it is to buy a home, how much it is to buy a car, what your credit card balance is, actually even how much you kind of hold in your accounts, is they control interest rates. A bank doesn't doesn't keep all of their money in there. Like when everyone said Silicon Valley Bank, one of the problems was there was a run on the banks where everybody tried to come in and take their money out. So there was a time when they were receiving a lot of money. So during the pandemic, they had pandemic stocks. Remember we did something on pandemic stocks? So all those companies, they might have been receiving billions and billions of dollars a day. So what does the bank do with that money? They lend it out. They lend it out for mortgages. They lend it out for cars. They lend it out to businesses. But then they also bought bonds. They bought U.S. bonds. And when you raise interest rates, I learned this when I was something. When you raise interest rates and bond prices have an inverse relationship like a teeter-totter. So what happens is when they raise interest rates, it lowers bond prices. So if bond prices are 100 and last year they raised interest rates 7 times in 2020, but 4 times they raised at 75 basis points. So if they raise at 75 basis points and par is 100, that makes that 98. Then it makes it 96. Then it makes it 92. So a lot of bond funds, average bond fund probably had maybe a 10% negative rate of return last year. It still received the same income, but they actually had to show that on the books. And then someone said, I want my money out of Silicon Valley Bank. And one day they had like $40 billion that people want to have out of the bank. So they have large numbers. They don't have that. That's when the Federal Reserve, that's when you saw the government step in.
Yeah.
So and this is the thing. That already was happening. That's why I'm a little surprised people are surprised that the bank didn't have all the money, because they don't.
Right.
So, I mean, that's normal.
Yep.
But I want to finish my last thing. 3 things that the bank can do is, number 1, they can print money. Number 2, they set interest rates. Number 3 that the government can do is tax everybody. The better you do, the better they do. So that's actually how they grow out of these things. And that's actually how the debts are paid, is that people do something. So I'll just pick Denzel, pick whoever your favorite actor is. They go out, they do a movie and they make $25 million or anybody, whatever anybody makes in the United States, they tax it. And then that's how the economy rolls.
Yeah. So George, in light of that, we got a few more minutes left. What should we be thinking about? Are there any practical tips of things that people need to be doing now in this inflationary environment?
Oh, okay. So here, let me just walk you through. I'll give you a couple. The first thing you should do is this. You should be a good steward over what you manage now, because now you see how inflation was. In other words, like you remember how we're starting to save? We always tell you to start, after you tithe, you start saving 10% of your income. Keep doing that. Look at what your mortgage rate is. And this is the first time I've ever said this. First time I've ever said this is that we have people who hyper pay off their mortgage, like I showed, like how I paid mine, where I was making double payments. But right now, if you have a 3% interest or a very low interest rate, we're actually we want to just look at holding that money, not paying it off so rapidly, and investing and buying some of these companies, or investing and diversifying your investments to buy things while they're a little bit lower. I really would look very hard at that. 3 is look at now what expenses are going to be in the future. Like, in other words, like if you have a car right now, you want to take care of that. If you go get a new car every couple of years, you might get a little shocked when you go in there right now and you see the interest rates on certain cars. Is if you're getting ready to buy something major, start looking at that right now, what the cost of that's going to be, because it appears, and then I'm just going off the Federal Reserve and what they're doing. It appears that they're not done raising interest rates currently, and so then they have to level them off, and then they may not be lowering them right away, and then they may have to lower them quite a bit before things change right away in these areas. So I definitely do those 3 things right away.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm telling you, I George, you and I have talked about EV vehicles, and so I'm waiting any day now to receive my Rivian. But in having to go ahead and buy it, I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, it's higher because interest rates are higher, and so that's one of the more unfortunate scenarios. But you bring up a really good point about the notion that in an economy such as ours, there's been a lot of talk about, will there be a recession? Will it be a soft landing? And, I've learned that the way to think about these kind of environments, particularly if there is a recession, is that things are on sale. Mm-hmm. And so I love the fact that you talked about, hey, if you got a low interest rate on your mortgage, instead of maybe doubling up payments to accelerate paying the mortgage off, maybe pay your regular monthly amount and take the money that you would pay in an additional payment and buy some stuff that's on sale right now. That's one of the things that I've been doing personally, just looking for those sales in the market and buying them now while they've dipped. Right. Many people may be aware of the phrase buy the dip, because then, when you come out of the dip, you have some additional revenue and you get to ride it up as well. So I love that.
Right. And hey, we'll maybe get into that also in our next podcast. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit deeper. But I do want to remind you, Bishop Moody, all listeners, is we did a webinar, we did a conference about 2 years ago. And I went off, and people, I just want to let you know and thank you. People come up to me to this day, because when the pandemic first hit and the markets were going down, and I started a pandemic stock list and different things. And what it is that you, in difficult economies, and then back to the recession is, and by the way, I want to, since we're doing definitions today, the definition of a recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP. That's gross domestic product. So what happens is that we're already experiencing a lot of these things now. So what happens is these are actually times when people do really well, actually. It's not a bad time. And you have to look at them as what companies, I'm going to leave it hanging out there a little bit today. We'll see. What companies would do really good when the economies aren't doing as well? There are certain companies that actually do even better. I got to give you one hint on one of them, is because I have a lot of relatives in the South and Mississippi. Is that Walmart is a company that that's the place to go. and if you were going to some other place, you might start going there now, because you got to make that dollar stretch a little bit. Make it holler a little bit. So there's just different things you want to look at, and always look at the positives in these environments, and you also see. You get opportunity.
That's so good. That's so good. Well, George, we're basically out of time, but it looks like we got a lot more to talk about in upcoming podcast episodes, because there was so much that we could have done a deeper dive on. But let's make sure that people know how to contact us in between podcast episodes. You can easily find me at vanmoody.org. You can also be sure to like and follow this podcast so that you are notified when new episodes are released. We released 2 episodes a month, and then we also have weekly episodes that we release. So if this podcast has added value to your life in any way, shape, or form, be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can catch me on vanmoody.org. And George, we're actually taking that content. We've had a number of people to ask for that content from 2 years ago when we talked about the pandemic stocks and all of that. So my team is working right now to repurpose that content and put it out on vanmoody.org. And so if you're interested in that information that George referenced, it's going to be up on our website soon. George, tell the people how they can find you, brother.
All right. First of all, yeah, that's awesome, because that was amazing when we did that 2 years ago. First of all, everybody, I want you to give me a high five. I want you to think of 5 people that you can also send this to. Like in your maybe friends, family, people who want to start developing that dream team, so you guys can invest, build generational wealth together. But you can always get a hold of me at georgebthompson.com. Also, I also bought a website, ican'tfindgeorge.com. If you're ever looking for me, you can type that in. That goes to all my social media on Instagram, Facebook, and then I got a TikTok with my kids going. So anyway, I need some friends on that, by the way. So hey, subscribe to all those, and then we will keep you updated as things progress.
Sounds good. Well, family, thanks for joining us today on the Financial Freedom Podcast with myself, Dr. Van Moody, and my brother from another mother, Pastor George B. Thompson, the financial maven, all the way from L.A. George, as always, brother, it's a pleasure, and I look forward to it next time. Take care, family.
Yes.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Freedom Podcast. For a broader range of topics, go to Van Moody's YouTube page or visit twccc.org.